Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the 7 isolated generations of the Jackson family that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from that helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. On a February night in 1983, the sky's fury tore through the Appalachian Mountains. Rain lashed down like whips, and the wind howled through the crevices of the rocks. A wild symphony of nature amidst that storm. A specter appeared on the threshold of the modern world at a desolate gas station, where the smell of wet asphalt and gasoline mingled under the flickering neon lights. The bell above the door chimed discordantly. The door flew open, carrying with it a biting gust of wind, and a young girl staggered inside. She was only 16, but her eyes held the horror of centuries. Her clothes were tattered, caked with mud and something darker, almost black in the dim light. Her pale skin revealed a network of old and new scratches. Her body trembled uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from a primal fear that had settled deep into her bones, making every muscle taut. The night attendant, a middle-aged man accustomed to the near absolute quiet of the late hours, stood frozen. He had seen his share of things on the night shift, but never a creature that looked both terrified and feral. The girl, later identified as Mary Jackson, stammered out a story. It was not a coherent narrative, but the disjointed fragments of a nightmare, uttered between gasping breaths, sometimes interrupted by a choked sob. She spoke of a valley, a place forgotten by God and left behind by time, hidden just a few dozen kilometers away. She whispered of marriages decided by cruel elders with soulless eyes, of children born with limbs bent the wrong way, with sounds that were not human but like stones grinding together. She spoke of a world imprisoned by an ancient oath and an invisible fence more formidable than barbed wire. The first officer on the scene, a seasoned veteran named Officer Miller, listened with professional skepticism. In his 20-year career, he had heard every imaginable story from teenage runaways, a wild tale. For attention, it was the most logical explanation, a neat drawer in his mind to file the case away. But there was something in Mary's eyes, an unshakable truth in her terror. That gave Miller pause. He looked at her scratched hands, at the deep bruises on her wrists that looked like the marks of shackles, and felt a cold dread creep up his spine. His cop's instinct, the one that had kept him alive for years, was screaming that this was different. Was this an elaborate lie concocted by a rebellious mind? Or was this the first cry for help? A faint echo from a terrible secret that had been buried under rock and silence for over a century. That question hung in the damp air of the stormy night, heavy and ominous. To understand the nightmare Mary Jackson had escaped, we must turn back the wheel of time, back to a different world. A world of the late 19th century, when America still had its untamed frontiers, its unmapped corners untouched by civilization. It was the era of Reconstruction, an age of new opportunities and extremist beliefs, when a person could easily vanish into the wilderness to start anew. It was here, around the year 1880, that the seeds of the Jackson family tragedy were sown. The Appalachian Mountains, one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, are a silent but powerful character in this story. By day, they display a majestic beauty, with lush, velvet green slopes, babbling brooks, and dense forests. But as dusk falls, that beauty transforms into something more primal and haunting. Fog clings to the peaks like giant spiderwebs, and the silence of the forest becomes heavy, almost suffocating. This land was both a sanctuary and a prison. Its treacherous terrain had sheltered countless outlaws and religious dissenters. For the Jackson family, it would become both. The man who led them into this isolation was Joseph Jackson, described in the few remaining records as a patriarch with fiery eyes, a devilishly charismatic presence, and an ironclad faith. He convinced a small group of 24 followers to join him, to leave behind a society he deemed morally decayed. Their founding oath was simple but absolute: to sever all contact with the unclean outside world, to marry only within the community to protect their pure bloodline, and to consider leaving the valley an unforgivable betrayal. They built a physical fence, but the most formidable barrier was erected in the minds of the generations that followed: a wall of fear, superstition, and devotion to the founders' teachings. Their valley was both a secluded paradise and a perfect natural prison. This isolation was not merely a doctrine, it was enforced with chilling efficiency from the very beginning. A story, passed down not in writing but in hushed, fearful whispers from one generation to the next, spoke of a young couple from the founding generation. They had been born outside the valley and still carried the memory of a wider world. Driven by love and a longing for the horizon, they attempted to flee. They were never seen again. The elders did not need to invent a punishment. The wilderness and the world beyond, they claimed, had delivered its own. The couple, it was said, was consumed by the very moral decay they had tried to return to. Their story became a foundational myth, a ghost story told to frighten children into obedience, a stark reminder that the fence was not just to keep the world out, but to keep them in. But later historians, piecing together the fragments of the story, have posed a disturbing question. Did Joseph's extreme decision truly stem from fanatical faith alone? Or was there another reason, something more private and dark? There are subtle hints in family documents, veiled allusions to a shadow that had followed his own lineage, prayers for forgiveness for a sin of the blood. If this were true, then his entire creation, this so-called sanctuary of purity, was in fact an elaborate scheme to conceal his own imperfection. The oath to protect the pure bloodline suddenly becomes a bitter irony, a curse disguised as a blessing. The first years passed in near absolute silence. The small community of the Jackson clan was self-sufficient, living apart from the currents of history. But beneath that tranquil surface, a quiet decay had begun. The tragedy did not arrive like a sudden storm, but crept in like a poisonous fog, slow and imperceptible. In this story, the initial protagonist is not an individual, but the clan itself, a collective entity being slowly consumed by its own oath. An autoimmune body turning on itself. The first signs of abnormality were not visible deformities, but the chilling gaps in the records. The old family Bible, with its worn leather cover and yellowed pages, became a silent witness to a slow-motion massacre. The names of newborn infants were inscribed in black ink, only to be followed a few lines later by a brief note, "Gone to be with the Lord," so frequently that it became a grim rule. Infant mortality, a silent tragedy played out behind closed doors, became an accepted reality. The children who did survive were often described as frail or slow, gentle words that masked a growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong. The community's paranoia was fed by more than just doctrine. It was fueled by rare, distorted glimpses of the world they had forsaken. Sometime in the 1920s, according to county records, a land surveyor mapping the rugged backcountry went missing for 3 days. When he was found, delirious and dehydrated, he spoke of stumbling upon a strange settlement of hollow-eyed folk who moved like ghosts through the trees and spoke in a language of clicks and whispers. His story was dismissed as the ravings of a man touched by fever. But for the Jacksons, the encounter was a terrifying omen. The lone man with his strange instruments was seen as a scout from the corrupt world, a spy sent by the devil. The incident prompted the elders to reinforce their isolation, pushing the community deeper into the shadows and solidifying their belief that the outside world was not just impure, but actively hunting them. Then, by the fourth generation, around the 1950s, the genetic curse could no longer be hidden. It etched itself onto the very skin of Joseph's descendants, the blue skin syndrome, due to a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia. Some children were born with a strange, bluish-gray tint to their skin. When the first such child was born, a horrified silence fell over the valley before the elders quickly turned fear into a tool of power. They called it the mark of Jackson, proof that they were a chosen people. The very mark of their decay was twisted into a symbol of superiority. The lie had become more sophisticated, more deeply embedded in the community's consciousness. But not everyone passively accepted that lie. Hidden in the log cabins, under loose floorboards, or in old chests, was a silent form of rebellion. Generations of Jackson women secretly chronicled their stories by the flickering light of candles, with hands calloused from labor. They wrote down their pain with charcoal nubs on scraps of paper. These diaries were not mere records of events. They were the silent screams of tortured souls. One entry, believed to be from 1937, reads, "Today I have birthed what should be my son, but God, in his infinite cruelty, has made it into something I cannot recognize as human. The elder says it is a test of our faith. But what God tests his children this way, I begin to suspect it is not God who tests us, but the men who claim to speak for him." These diaries, at the time, were just buried voices, but they were waiting, like time bombs, to one day explode and expose the horrifying truth. The storm that had allowed Mary Jackson to escape was not just a meteorological event. It was a crack in the foundations of a century-old prison. For years, Mary had nurtured a spark of defiance, a seed of doubt planted by the furtive, sorrowful glances of her mother and the hushed whispers she overheard between the women. The storm was her chance, as a massive oak tree, weakened by age, crashed down upon a section of the perimeter fence. She ran. She ran with the wind at her back and the ghosts of her ancestors at her heels, fueled by a desperate, primal need to see if the world her elders described a world of sin and corruption was the only alternative to the one she knew. Back at the station, Officer Miller's professional skepticism was at war with his gut. He brought Mary a blanket and a cup of hot coffee, watching as her trembling hands struggled to hold it. He asked questions gently, trying to poke holes in her story. But every detail she provided, no matter how outlandish, was delivered with the same raw terror. He decided to call his superior, Sheriff Brody, a man who had policed these hills for 30 years and knew their secrets, in his office. Brody listened on the phone, his silence growing heavier with each word Miller relayed. After hanging up, he didn't move for a long moment. He stared at a large, faded map of the county pinned to his wall, his eyes fixed on the blank, rugged expanse where Mary claimed her valley was. As a boy, his grandfather had told him stories of the shadow folk, a community that had vanished into the mountains a lifetime ago, tales he had always dismissed as campfire lore. Now, Mary's terrified voice had given those old ghosts a chilling substance. "Keep her there," Brody finally said into his radio, his voice grim. "Don't let anyone near her. I'll assemble a team. We're going in at dawn." The decision was made. A small, heavily armed convoy would venture into the uncharted territory, a journey into a pocket of the country that, for all intents and purposes, had ceased to exist 100 years ago. They were preparing for the unknown, but nothing could have prepared them for the truth. As the first rays of dawn pierced the morning mist, the convoy of police cruisers and a single ambulance snaked its way up a forgotten logging trail. The air grew colder, the trees thicker, creating a canopy that blocked out the sun. About a mile from their destination, the lead vehicle screeched to a halt. Hanging from the low branch of a gnarled chestnut tree was a crude effigy, a figure made of sticks and bound with scraps of burlap. It was adorned with the bleached skulls of small animals and strands of human-looking hair that danced eerily in the breeze. It wasn't a scarecrow. It was a warning, a territorial marker meant to inspire primal fear. Brody stepped out of his cruiser, his hand resting on his sidearm. His grandfather's campfire tales had not mentioned this. This was not the mark of a people in hiding. It was the mark of a people who would defend their isolation. For a moment, he considered turning back, but a glance at the determined face of Dr. Thorne in the ambulance behind him solidified his resolve. They pushed forward, the silence in their vehicles now heavier, more menacing. When they finally reached the coordinates, they found the downed oak tree and the broken fence, just as Mary had described. What lay beyond was a scene suspended in time. A small collection of crudely built log cabins stood clustered in a clearing, smoke curling lazily from their stone chimneys. But it was the inhabitants who emerged from the cabins, drawn by the sound of engines. That caused the officers to stop dead in their tracks. It was a gallery of human suffering. Around 240 people, their faces a tapestry of genetic anomalies, stared back with a mixture of fear and dull curiosity. There were individuals with misshapen skulls, cleft palates, and fused fingers. Many had the telltale bluish tint to their skin. The young medical examiner, Dr. Varys Thorne, felt a wave of nausea. He noticed a small boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with wide-set eyes and an underdeveloped jaw, staring not at the armed officers, but at the stainless steel watch on Thorne's wrist. The boy took a hesitant step forward, his gaze locked on the way the morning light glinted off the polished metal. He had likely never seen a reflective surface so perfect, a piece of technology so alien. The boy's simple, uncorrupted curiosity in the face of their armed intrusion was a profound testament to their complete and total isolation from the modern world. The investigators were met not with words, but with a series of guttural clicks, whistles, and moans, a complex, non-verbal language born of necessity. The first challenge was simply one of identification. The names they offered were a confusing echo of the past, with dozens of men named Joseph or Ezekiel, making it impossible to map a family tree. The only record was the old Bible, but its entries were deliberately cryptic, with parents often omitted or children simply listed as a child of the valley. A chilling euphemism for the products of the most egregious incestuous relationships. Amidst the confusion, a woman of about 50, whose name was Martha Jackson, stepped forward, though her face bore the physical signs of a lineage. Her eyes held a lucid intelligence that was startling. She became the expedition's reluctant Rosetta Stone. In a slow, halting voice, she confirmed Mary's story, but with a chilling lack of emotion that spoke volumes about her reality. As she spoke, a large, broad-shouldered man emerged from the largest cabin. He didn't speak, but his presence was a physical weight. He stood behind Martha, his arms crossed, his cold eyes fixed on Sheriff Brody. This was Silas, a man who was clearly not an elder, but served as their enforcer. His knuckles were scarred, and he carried himself with an air of brutal authority. His silent vigil was a clear message: cooperation had consequences. Martha's voice faltered for a moment under his gaze, a flicker of fear crossing her face before being replaced by the same mask of resignation. "The elders decide," she repeated, her voice now barely a whisper. "It is God's will." She revealed that her own husband was also her first cousin and her nephew, and that her father was her great-uncle. Her testimony, delivered under the silent threat of Silas, was perhaps more horrifying than any physical deformity. It was the sound of a soul that had been imprisoned for so long. It had forgotten what freedom felt like. The pressure on the investigators escalated with every passing hour. They were uncovering a multi-generational human rights catastrophe. Before they found the shack at the edge of the settlement, a strange, acrid smell drew them to another cabin, one that seemed to serve as the community's birthing room and infirmary. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and decay. Bunches of strange plants hung from the rafters, and shelves were lined with jars containing murky poultices. On a crude wooden table in the center of the room lay a set of primitive medical instruments, carved from bone and sharpened stone. But the most disturbing discovery was a small, wooden box in the corner. Inside, wrapped in linen, were the tiny, skeletal remains of several newborns, conjoined twins. Infants with severe cranial deformities, the ones who hadn't even survived their first day. It was a museum of failed births, a testament to the women who had labored in this room, praying for a miracle and receiving only heartbreak. This grim prelude set the stage for an even greater horror. The true midpoint of this unfolding nightmare, the moment that would forever burn itself into the minds of everyone present, came with the discovery of the house of special children, separated from the other cabins by a grove of dead trees. The windowless shack radiated an aura of profound misery. Inside, the stench of sickness and despair was overwhelming. In the gloom, investigators found several small figures, children with deformities so severe they were barely recognizable as human. Some were tethered to rudimentary beds with ropes. They were the ones whose genetic afflictions were deemed too shocking even for the desensitized eyes of the valley. It was not a nursery. It was a warehouse for discarded souls. But what truly broke the hardened investigators was not just the sight of the children, but an object on the far wall. Nailed to the rough-hewn logs was a large piece of smooth bark. On it, a crude chart had been drawn in charcoal. Next to symbols representing each child were other marks: a sun, a moon, a storm cloud, meticulous notations of their divine messages. It was a logbook of their suffering, a cold, calculated system for harvesting prophecies from their pain. This discovery unlocked the final, most twisted layer of the community's belief system. The elders had crafted a perverse mythology to rationalize the suffering they had engineered. Children born with severe problems were not seen as victims of a genetic curse, but as beings touched by God, sent as a test of the community's faith. Some of the most profoundly affected children, unable to speak or move, were treated as oracles. Their inarticulate sounds, their spasms and moans, were interpreted by the elders as divine messages that guided the community's decisions. The ultimate victims of their system had been transformed into its holiest relics. It was at this moment that the medical experts on the scene realized they were facing something entirely new. This was not just a collection of rare syndromes. This was the ghastly, logical endpoint of a century-long, involuntary experiment in human genetics. A tragedy that would rewrite the medical textbooks. The discovery in the windowless shack had shattered any remaining semblance of professional detachment among the investigators. The cold, calculated chart of suffering nailed to the wall transformed the scene from a tragedy of ignorance into a landscape of methodical cruelty. This was the turning point. The question was no longer simply what had happened here, but how it could be proven in a court of law, how to quantify a century of agony driven by a grim necessity for concrete evidence. Sheriff Brody ordered a forensic team to begin a systematic search of the grounds, focusing on an area near the community's small overgrown cemetery. What they found would provide the story's most haunting, irrefutable proof. It began with a single, small bone, unearthed by a young anthropologist, then another, and another. Soon, the team realized they were not digging in a cemetery extension, but in a mass grave. Over the next several days, under the silent gaze of the remaining Jackson clan members, the team painstakingly excavated the remains of more than 300 infants and children. The forensic reports confirmed a horrifying, escalating pattern of deformities through the generations. The oldest skeletons, from the late 19th century, showed relatively mild anomalies, but as they dug through the layers of time, the bones told a story of accelerating decay. Skulls grotesquely malformed, limbs missing or fused, and in the most recent layers, the delicate, intertwined skeletons of conjoined twins who had never drawn a breath. The earth itself had become a ledger of the family's genetic collapse. While the forensic team unearthed the sins of the past, another group of investigators made a breakthrough of a different kind. In the sealed basement of the main house, hidden beneath a loose floor stone, they found a collection of leather-bound diaries. These were the secret testaments of the Jackson women, written in a mixture of archaic English and the valley's own unique dialect. The brittle pages were filled with elegant spidery script that chronicled an unbroken line of female suffering. They were not just records of births and deaths. They were manifestos of quiet desperation. There were accounts of escape attempts, of women who tried to induce miscarriages using herbal concoctions, and, most chillingly, of what they called merciful ends, euthanizing newborns whose deformities were incompatible with life. One passage, dated 1937, read, "Today I have birthed what should be my son, but God, in his infinite cruelty, has made it into something I cannot recognize as human. The elder says it is a test of our faith, but what God tests his children this way, I begin to suspect it is not God who tests us, but the men who claim to speak for him." These diaries were the voices of the victims, a chorus of anguish that reached across the decades to condemn the men who had silenced them. As news of the grim discoveries began to leak to the press, an unexpected witness came forward, an elderly woman named Sarah Williams, from a town 50 miles away, contacted the sheriff's office. She claimed to recognize a distinctive, hand-carved locket seen in a photograph of one of the Jackson women. With trembling hands, she presented a matching locket, one that had belonged to a younger sister, Clara, who had vanished without a trace in 1952. Clara, she recounted, had been courted by a handsome but unsettlingly intense man from the hills. A man who spoke of a pure life away from the sins of the world. He had disappeared the same week Clara did. For the first time, investigators had concrete, testimonial evidence that the valley's isolation was a porous wall, one that the elders would breach when they desired to bring in new blood, often against the will of their victims. The community was not just a prison, it was a predator's den. The final piece of scientific evidence came from the lab of Dr. Elizabeth Norcross, a geneticist who analyzed samples from the living community members using techniques that were cutting edge for the time. She reconstructed the Jackson family's genealogical tree. The results were unprecedented. The coefficient of inbreeding in the most recent generations surpasses anything ever documented in human populations, she stated in her official report. In some cases, we are talking about individuals who share more than 70% of their genetic material. It was a scientific confirmation of the horror, a clinical diagnosis for a century of sin, the bones, the diaries, the testimony of a grieving sister, and the DNA had come together to tell a single, undeniable story. The weight of the physical evidence was crushing, yet a crucial question remained unanswered. Was this tragedy the result of blind, fanatical ignorance? Or was it a deliberate, calculated act of evil? The answer came from an unlikely source. A 19-year-old named Jacob Jackson, who possessed a keen intellect and relatively mild physical deformities, had been watching the investigators with a quiet, intense curiosity. One evening, he approached Dr. Thorne and, in a low conspiratorial whisper, revealed that he had something to show them. He led them to a hidden compartment behind the hearth in the elder's cabin. Inside was not another diary, but a collection of newspaper clippings and, shockingly, several scientific articles about genetics and heredity, dating back decades. They knew, Jacob stated, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and righteous anger. They knew what they were causing. His confession unraveled the community's greatest lie. He described secret meetings where the elders, led by the stern patriarch Ezekiel Jackson, would discuss which marital pairings would produce fewer monsters, as they callously referred to the children. They had studied the articles, not to stop the suffering, but to manage it, to control the outcome of their horrific experiment. It was not ignorance. It was calculated, malevolent control. This revelation transformed the nature of the investigation. This was no longer just a case of abuse and neglect. It was a conspiracy to deliberately perpetuate practices they knew to be harmful, effectively sentencing generations to lives of unimaginable pain. Jacob's testimony broke the dam of silence. During a formal interrogation, one of the younger elders, a man named Phineas, whose face was a mask of tormented conflict, suffered a complete psychological collapse, sobbing uncontrollably. He confessed not only to the scientific knowledge, but to the brutal internal politics of the council. He revealed how Ezekiel used the prophecies harvested from the suffering children in the shack to maintain his iron grip on power. A rival's family would be cursed with a divine message foretelling tragedy, a message that would then be fulfilled when Ezekiel arranged a genetically disastrous marriage for that family's daughter. The prophecies were not just a twisted justification that said they were a weapon of political control, used to eliminate dissent and ensure Ezekiel's bloodline, which he believed to be the purest, remained dominant. This testimony was corroborated by a final, stunning discovery. Analysis of DNA from personal items belonging to the founder, Joseph Jackson, revealed that he himself had been a carrier for several of the rare recessive conditions that plagued his descendants, including the gene for methemoglobinemia. The entire community, the sanctuary of purity, may have been founded on a lie, a desperate attempt by one man to hide his own perceived genetic flaws from the world. A sin of pride that had cascaded into a century of damnation for his children. The full monstrous scope of the crime was now laid bare. In November 1983, after 9 months of intense investigation, the authorities made the decision to intervene definitively. The operation was planned with the precision of a military exercise, involving medical teams, social workers, psychologists, and police forces. Their goal was to evacuate the 237 surviving members of the Jackson community with as little trauma as possible, a near impossible task when dealing with a population that had never seen a car, a television, or the face of a stranger who wasn't an object of fear. The evacuation was a surreal spectacle. The community members, passive and bewildered, were led onto buses, their wide eyes reflecting a world they couldn't comprehend. They were transported to a specially adapted wing of a state hospital, a sterile, brightly lit environment that was as alien to them as another planet. There, the true medical consequences were laid bare. Comprehensive evaluations revealed that 98% of the community members suffered from at least one significant genetic condition. Among the children under 10, the figure was 100%. But beyond the physical toll, the psychological damage was profound. A young social worker witnessed a scene that encapsulated their plight. During the first meal, the children were offered a choice between an apple and an orange. Most stared blankly, paralyzed by a concept they had never encountered: personal choice. But one small girl, no older than 8, looked from the apple to the orange, then back again. After a long moment, she tentatively reached out and took the apple. It was a minuscule act, but for the staff watching, it was monumental. It was the first fragile seed of autonomy planted in a mind that had only ever known absolute obedience. The question of criminal responsibility proved to be the most complex challenge. Investigators identified 12 elders who, based on Jacob's testimony and the hidden documents, appeared to have knowingly perpetuated the system. However, a cruel irony was at play. Many of these men also suffered from significant cognitive limitations, themselves the products of the very system they enforced. How could one prosecute individuals who were simultaneously perpetrators and victims? After extensive and agonizing deliberations, the state opted to focus on rescue and rehabilitation rather than widespread punishment. Ezekiel Jackson and 2 other elders, who were deemed to have full cognitive capacity, were charged with a battery of crimes, including felony child abuse and criminal negligence. The others were considered legally incompetent to stand trial. It was a deeply unsatisfying conclusion for many, a legal compromise in the face of an evil so profound and tangled that the law itself seemed inadequate to address it. The community had been rescued, but true justice for the hundreds who had suffered and died in the valley remained elusive, a ghost that would haunt the legal system for years to come. The difficult process of integration began in January 1984, and it was here that the true, devastating scale of the Jackson family's isolation became clear. For the adults, especially the older members, the modern world was not a haven but a sensory torture chamber. The constant hum of electricity, the glare of artificial lights, the sheer speed of a passing car, these were not marvels, but relentless assaults on minds that had only ever known the quiet rhythms of the valley. They were plagued by profound agoraphobia, terrified by open spaces and the crushing presence of so many strangers. Many never fully adapted. The world that had rescued them remained an indecipherable, terrifying puzzle. They would spend the rest of their lives in specialized institutions, their bodies freed from the valley, but their minds forever imprisoned within its invisible walls. The world built by Joseph Jackson had finally collapsed, and its ruins were the shattered psyches of his descendants. For the children, however, the prognosis was more promising, though still fraught with challenges. Those with preserved cognitive abilities demonstrated a surprising resilience. They were like plants that had grown in darkness, now tentatively reaching for the sun. Intensive medical treatments and years of therapy helped them navigate their new reality. Surgical procedures corrected some of the most severe physical malformations, while dedicated therapists helped them develop basic skills many take for granted. Mary Jackson, whose courageous escape had ignited the entire investigation, became an inspiring example of this resilience. After years of rehabilitation, she not only completed high school, but went on to become a passionate advocate for the rights of people with genetic disabilities. Her voice a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit. In 1985, the Jackson Foundation was established, a formal acknowledgement that the family had been redefined in the eyes of the world. They were no longer a lost community, but a living case study. The genetic material collected from the family members became an invaluable resource for researchers worldwide, a biological library of rare conditions. Their private, century-long agony was transformed into public knowledge, helping to identify specific genes and develop predictive tests that would save countless others from similar fates. It was a deeply ironic redefinition the pure bloodline Joseph Jackson had sought to protect through isolation had, because of that very isolation, become one of the most scientifically important, genetically impure lineages ever discovered. This redefinition also sparked a complex legal battle over the valley itself. The land, which Joseph Jackson had acquired legally in the 1880s, was technically a private estate. Distant, previously unknown relatives, armed with century-old deeds, emerged from the woodwork to lay claim to the property, viewing it not as a site of tragedy, but as a valuable piece of real estate. For months, the courts were mired in a debate that pitted modern property law against the unprecedented human rights crisis. Ultimately, the state exercised eminent domain, seizing the land and declaring it a site of historical significance, arguing that its value to public memory and scientific understanding far outweighed any private claim. The decision was a landmark, establishing a precedent that some places are so saturated with history. They belong to everyone and no one. 20 years after the community's discovery, in 2003, a documentary team located and interviewed 45 of the survivors. Their testimonies painted a mosaic of human experience. Some had managed to integrate fully into mainstream society, building careers and families of their own. Their past, a shadow they had learned to live with. Others resided in assisted living communities, requiring continuous support. One particularly tragic case was that of an elder named Jedediah, a man who had been on the council but was deemed cognitively impaired. He spent 2 decades in a state facility, never speaking a word to the staff, but meticulously arranging and rearranging pebbles in the courtyard into complex patterns. A therapist finally realized he was recreating the genealogical charts the elders had used to plan marriages. Even in his silent, institutionalized world, he was still trapped in the cold, cruel calculus of the valley, his mind forever performing the duties of his former life. And some remained institutionalized, their bodies and minds forever marked by the involuntary experiment to which they had been subjected. The most poignant legacy, however, is that of Jacob Jackson, the young man who had dared to expose the elders' deliberate deceit did not turn his back on the science that had defined his family's tragedy. He became a geneticist. He dedicated his entire career to studying the very rare diseases that had flowed through his own veins. At a medical conference in 2010, he stood before a crowd of the world's leading scientists and declared, "What happened to my family cannot be undone, but we can ensure that those lives were not lost in vain. Each gene we identify, each mechanism we understand, each child saved from a condition we can now prevent or treat, is a victory over the obscurantism that held my family captive for generations." It was the ultimate act of redemption, transforming a legacy of suffering into a mission of healing, using knowledge as a weapon against the darkness of the past. Yet, even with this redemption, some secrets remain buried. The valley itself was eventually transformed into a state-protected nature reserve. A small, simple memorial was erected at the entrance, its plaque reading, in memory of those who lived and died in isolation, and as a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. But the story of Sarah Williams's sister, Clara, and the other women who may have been brought into the valley against their will was never fully resolved. No remains were ever positively identified. They are the final, silent victims of the Jackson clan, their fates a haunting, unanswered question, a lingering secret that the valley has yet to give up. The case of the 7 generations of the Jackson family is more than just a medical curiosity. It is a profound and disturbing parable. It forces us to confront a timeless question: what is the true cost of fanaticism in the obsessive pursuit of a pure ideal? Joseph Jackson and the elders who followed him created the very corruption they claimed to be fleeing. Their sanctuary became a laboratory of horrors, their faith a justification for absolute control. The story serves as an enduring warning that isolation, whether physical or ideological, is the most fertile ground for extremism to grow. When a community cuts itself off from the world, it risks losing not only its connection to humanity, but its very humanity itself. The genetic samples preserved from the Jackson community continue to be a valuable resource for researchers. In 2015, using sequencing technologies that didn't exist when the case first came to light, scientists were able to map the specific patterns of genetic deterioration over the 7 generations, providing unprecedented insights into how the human gene pool responds to extreme stress. However, this scientific boon sparked a fierce ethical debate that rages to this day. Bioethicists questioned whether it was moral to reduce a century of human suffering to a set of data points. Were the survivors being treated as patients to be healed, or as specimens to be studied? The debate drew a sharp line between the pursuit of knowledge and the duty of compassion, questioning if the scientific community, in its quest to understand the Jackson's tragedy, was creating a new, more subtle form of exploitation. In a way, the story is not over. Its echoes persist in scientific journals and in the ongoing debate about the delicate balance between religious freedom and the protection of children. It is a story of isolation, control, and suffering. But it is also one of resilience, scientific discovery, and finally, redemption through knowledge. It reminds us that truth, however painful it may be, is always the first step toward healing.